My siblings took advantage of the circumstances and stole my share of the inheritance, taking property worth $10,000, while leaving me with junk worth only $150. You know that feeling when your whole world collapses, and you're left standing in the wreckage, wondering what the hell just happened? That's me right now. James Hartwell, 45 years old, UPS driver from West Virginia, standing in what used to be my grandfather's diner. The silence here is so thick, you could cut it with a butter knife. This place used to be alive. The smell of bacon grease and black coffee. The sound of coins dropping into that old NCR cash register from the 1950s. Now it's just empty, like someone took Atlantis and drained all the water out of it. My American dream didn't just die here. It got murdered in broad daylight. I'm staring at this ancient cash register sitting on the counter like some kind of metal tombstone, heavy as a boat anchor and about as useful, or so I thought. This thing is literally my entire inheritance from Grandpa Joe when he passed in 2023. Well, that and a few photo albums and some rusty tools that probably belonged in a museum. See, when Grandpa died, I was on the road for 3 weeks, hauling packages from Charleston to Pittsburgh and back. That's the thing about being a UPS driver. The packages don't stop moving just because your heart stops beating. My brother Liam called me up, all sweet as pie, saying he'd handle everything with the estate, take care of the legal stuff, make sure everything was fair and square. Fair and square. Those words taste like sawdust in my mouth now. I remember being 5 years old, standing on a milk crate behind this very counter. Grandpa Joe would let me push the buttons on the cash register after every sale. Ka-ching! The sound was like magic to a little kid. He'd ruffle my hair and explain how every coin in that drawer represented someone's sweat and effort, how you had to respect honest work, respect the people who earned those coins. You know Jimmy, he once told me while handing me a root beer, you don't count a man's worth by what's in his wallet. It's in how many people smile when he walks in the door. Those were simpler times. Back when a handshake meant something. When family actually meant family. When I thought the world made sense. When I finally made it back home from that long haul, ready to mourn properly and help settle things, I found out just how well Liam had handled everything. The diner was sold. The land was sold. Everything was gone faster than a politician's promise on election day. Turns out, Liam had dug up some power of attorney paperwork I'd signed years earlier when Grandpa first got sick. I thought I was just helping with medical decisions if something happened. Didn't realize I'd basically handed my brother a blank check to sell my childhood out from under me. And there stood Liam and my sister Sarah, grinning like cats who'd found the cream. They handed me this cash register with all the ceremony of giving someone a participation trophy. Liam actually had the nerve to say it with a straight face. Hey, Jimmy, remember how you used to love pushing those buttons when you were little? Well, here you go. Something to remember Grandpa by. Sarah nodded along like one of those bobblehead dolls. We thought you'd appreciate something with sentimental value. Sentimental value, right? Because apparently the land our family had owned for 3 generations, the diner that put food on our table and sent us all to school, none of that had sentimental value. While I was out there busting my back to make an honest living, they'd sold everything to some developer who wanted to put up a car wash. A car wash! On the spot where Grandpa Joe served the best apple pie in 3 counties, where he listened to farmers complain about their crops and helped more than one family get through tough times with a free meal and no questions asked. They divided up the money between themselves, real neat and tidy. $210,000, split right down the middle, $105,000 each. My share of what should have been a 3-way split, this cash register, some photos, and a toolbox that looked like it survived the Civil War. I did the math later. Generous estimate. The whole lot was worth maybe $150 at a garage sale. So instead of my rightful $70,000, I got what amounted to pocket change and a really expensive paperweight. Benjamin Franklin once said that the love of money is the root of all evil. I'd add that it's also the root of all family drama. When I asked them how the hell they figured this was fair, Liam got all defensive. Started talking about how I was never around anyway, how I didn't help take care of Grandpa in his final years, which was rich, considering I was the one sending money home every month to help with his medical bills while they were both living their comfortable suburban lives. I threatened to take them to court. That's when Sarah smiled that ice-cold smile of hers and dropped the bombshell. Her husband wasn't just any lawyer. His daddy was a judge. County connections, political favors, the whole 9 yards. Any lawsuit I filed would get tied up in legal red tape for years, maybe decades. They had it all figured out, every angle covered. What kind of brother sells your childhood and hands you the receipt in the form of a rusted cash register? So there I was, loading my inheritance into the back of my truck. A cash register that probably hadn't worked since Carter was in office, a box of faded photographs, and some tools that Grandpa probably used to fix everything that broke in this place, which, knowing Grandpa, was everything at one time or another. I drove around for hours that day, trying to figure out what to do next. My apartment was barely big enough for me, let alone a massive cash register and boxes of Grandpa's belongings. I needed somewhere to put all these precious memories, somewhere I could actually think without constantly being reminded of how badly I'd been screwed. Finally ended up renting this little storage unit on the outskirts of town. 10 by 12 feet of concrete and dreams gone wrong. That storage unit became my fortress of solitude. Superman had his crystal cave. I had my concrete box filled with the remnants of a life that used to make sense. I'd go there after work, sit on an old folding chair, and try to make peace with getting screwed over by the 2 people who were supposed to have my back. The cash register sat there in the corner, like a silent witness to everything that had gone wrong. Sometimes I'd catch myself staring at it, wondering what Grandpa was thinking when he bought it. Probably never imagined it would end up as the centerpiece of his grandson's personal apocalypse. Those first few weeks were rough, really rough. You know how they say that grief comes in waves? Well, betrayal comes in tsunamis. 1 minute you're fine. The next minute you're punching the wall of a storage unit because your own blood sold you out for 30 pieces of silver. I started talking to myself. Not crazy talk, just conversation. Like Grandpa Joe was still around, still listening. I'd tell him about my day, about the packages I delivered, about the people I met on my route. Anything to fill the silence that felt like it was eating me alive. One evening, I was going through those old photo albums, trying to find something that felt like hope. There was this picture of Grandpa behind the counter of the diner, probably taken in the 1960s. He was younger than I am now, wearing that same apron he wore every day until the day he died. Big smile, eyes full of life and possibility. That picture hit me like a freight train. This was a man who built something from nothing, who turned a greasy spoon into a community gathering place, who taught 3 generations of kids that hard work and honesty still mattered in this world. And his own grandchildren had sold it all for a quick buck. I tried to find some humor in the situation. Dark humor, but humor nonetheless. I'd tell people I had my own private museum now, the Museum of Family Betrayal. Admission was free, but the emotional cost would break your heart. But even in my worst moments, even when the anger was so thick I could taste it, I'd remember something Grandpa used to say about memory being the only paradise from which we cannot be cast out. Maybe that was true. Maybe the memories were worth more than the money. Still didn't make the betrayal hurt any less. But it kept me from giving up completely. The cash register became my obsession. This massive, complicated piece of machinery that I couldn't figure out and couldn't ignore. Sometimes I'd try to open it, just to see what was inside. But the thing was locked up tighter than Fort Knox, and I didn't have the key. Probably lost decades ago, along with a lot of other things. I started cleaning it, though. Every few days, I'd take a cloth and polish the brass, wipe down the keys, try to bring back some of its old shine. It was therapeutic, in a weird way, like I was taking care of Grandpa Joe one last time. Weeks later, I drove past the old diner location. They were already tearing it down. I watched the bulldozer knock down walls that had stood for 70 years, erasing decades of community history in one afternoon. The new owners didn't waste any time turning my childhood into a parking lot. That night, I sat in my storage unit and wondered if this was what rock bottom felt like. 45 years old, living out a concrete box, My entire family legacy reduced to a cash register and some photographs that nobody else wanted. But you know what they say about rock bottom? It gives you a solid foundation to build on. I started thinking about Grandpa Joe's stories. He used to tell me about the early days of the diner, how he'd started with nothing but a dream and a willingness to work 18-hour days, how he'd met interesting people who'd stopped by over the years, traveling salesmen, musicians, even some Hollywood types who were passing through. He'd always get this distant look in his eyes when he talked about those days, like he was remembering something important, something that mattered more than just serving coffee and pie. Something he never quite explained, but always seemed proud of. There was this one story he told about helping out some young guy back in the early 1960s. Guy was trying to make it in show business, had big dreams, but no money. Grandpa lent him some cash, just being neighborly. Said he never heard from the guy again, but Grandpa never seemed bitter about it. Said that's just how life works sometimes. You help people and hope for the best. I used to think those stories were just Grandpa's way of making his life sound more interesting than it was. Now I wonder if there was more to them than I realized. Old guys like Grandpa, they didn't usually make stuff up. They lived through too much real drama to need fiction. I wasn't ready to let Grandpa Joe's life story end in a junk heap. Not yet. Every time I looked at that hulking cash register my siblings thought was worthless, I felt like there was something I was missing, something important. Old machines like this, they've seen a lot of history, heard a lot of conversations, processed a lot of dreams and disappointments. What if this wasn't just a consolation prize? What if it was something more? As I sit here now, months later, looking at this mechanical relic that's become my roommate and my reminder of better times, I can't help but wonder what secrets it might be hiding. This thing that weighs more than a small refrigerator, this piece of history that my siblings were so eager to get rid of. What if this isn't the end of my American dream, but just the intermission? What if that old cash register, sitting there silent and stubborn in the corner of my storage unit, is waiting to tell me something that could change everything? Turns out, finding out the only way to move forward is to go deeper into the past. Who knew that wisdom would come from sitting in a storage unit that smelled like WD, 40, and broken dreams? Those first few months after getting royally screwed by my own siblings, I developed a routine. Clock out from UPS, drive to the storage unit, sit in that folding chair like it was my therapy couch. Sometimes I'd crack open a beer, sometimes just a Coke. Always ended up going through those photo albums, try and make sense of how everything went so wrong. You know how they say memory is the only paradise from which we cannot be cast out? Maybe that's true, because sitting there with those faded pictures was the only place I felt like myself anymore. Not the guy who got conned by his own family. Not the middle-aged UPS driver with nothing to show for 45 years of living. Just Jimmy, Grandpa Joe's grandson, remembering better times. There was this one photo I kept coming back to. Grandpa standing behind the counter in 1967, arms crossed, wearing that permanent smile he had for customers. Behind him, you could see that old cash register, all polished brass and working buttons. It looked important then. Significant, like it belonged in that diner, not gathering dust in my concrete hideaway. I started talking to that cash register. Yeah, I know how that sounds. But when you're spending your evenings alone with your thoughts and a bunch of old memories, you either talk to something or start talking to yourself. The cash register seemed like the better option. Less crazy, somehow. I'd tell about my day, about Mrs. Henderson on Maple Street, who always had cookies ready when I delivered her packages, about the new guy at work who thought he knew everything about efficient routing, about how Liam and Sarah probably never even thought about what they'd done to me. Sometimes I'd share Grandpa's old stories, the ones about Hollywood types and traveling musicians who'd stop by the diner. Back then, I thought he was just embellishing his memories to make his life sound more interesting. Now I wasn't so sure. Old guys like Grandpa, they didn't usually make stuff up. They lived through too much real drama to need fiction. The register just sat there, silent as a tombstone. But at least it listened better than my family ever did. Winter came early that year. West Virginia winters have a way of getting into your bones, making everything feel colder than it actually is. The storage unit had no heat, so I'd bundle up like I was going Arctic exploring just to spend time with my inheritance. My breath would fog up in the cold air, making the whole place feel like some kind of shrine to disappointment. But I kept going back. Something about that routine, that ritual of remembering, kept me sane. Or maybe it was slowly driving me crazy. Hard to tell the difference, sometimes. One evening in February, I decided the cash register needed a proper cleaning. Not just a surface dusting I'd been doing, but a real deep clean. If this thing was going to be my roommate for the foreseeable future, it might as well look respectable. I brought a toolbox full of cleaning supplies. Brass polish, cotton rags, some old toothbrushes for getting into the crevices. The kind of thorough job Grandpa Joe would have appreciated. He always said if you can do something, do it right or don't do it at all. The cash register was more complicated than I'd expected. All these intricate mechanisms, springs and gears that probably hadn't moved in decades. I'd been thinking about finding someone to make a key for it. Maybe one of those old-school locksmiths who worked on antiques. But the thing was so ancient, I wasn't even sure what kind of lock mechanism it used. As I worked my way around the sides, polishing each piece of brass until it gleamed, I noticed something odd. The back panel didn't quite sit flush with the rest of the machine. At first, I thought it was just warped from age. These old machines weren't exactly precision instruments, but when I pushed on it gently, it gave a little, like it was designed to move. My heart started beating faster. You know that feeling when you're about to discover something you're not supposed to know? That mix of excitement and terror that makes your hands shake? I grabbed a flashlight and examined the back panel more carefully. There were tiny hinges, almost invisible unless you were looking for them, and what looked like a small catch mechanism, disguised as part of the decorative metalwork. This wasn't damage or wear. This was intentional. A hidden compartment built right into the cash register. Grandpa Joe, you sneaky old devil. What were you hiding? It took me 20 minutes of careful prodding before I figured out how to open it. You had to press two specific spots simultaneously while sliding a third piece to the right, like some kind of mechanical puzzle lock. Whoever designed this didn't want it open by accident. When the panel finally swung open, I half expected dust and spider webs. Instead, I found a package wrapped in thick plastic, the old school kind of used back in the day, yellow with age but still doing its job. My hands were shaking so bad, I almost dropped the flashlight. Inside the cloth was a thick bundle of papers tied with what had once been white string, but now looked like dried wheat. The papers were old but in remarkable condition. Receipts, mostly. Handwritten receipts for food, supplies, small loans. The kind of paperwork you'd expect from a small-town diner. But underneath the receipts was something else. Something that made my blood run cold and my heart race at the same time. A contract, hand-typed on letterhead I'd never seen before. Dated 1961. I had to read it 3 times before my brain would accept what I was seeing. My grandfather, Joseph Franklin Hartwell, had loaned $300 to a young television producer named Sheldon Leonard. In exchange for the loan, Grandpa Joe was to receive 2% of any royalties from a pilot show Leonard was developing. $300 in 1961. That was like $3,000 today. Maybe more. For a guy running a small-town diner, that was serious money. The kind of money you only risk if you really believe in someone. The show was called The Andy Griffith Show. Have you ever felt like the past suddenly came alive and breathed right in your face? That's exactly what this was like. Because I knew that show. Hell, everyone in America knew that show. Grandpa Joe and I used to watch reruns together on his old black and white TV every Sunday afternoon. He'd always smile during the opening credits, humming along with the whistling theme song. Never said a word about knowing anything behind the scenes. Just smiled that quiet smile of his and asked if I wanted more iced tea. The man had been sitting on a connection to one of the most beloved TV shows in American history, and he never said a word, not even to his grandson, who watched it with him every week. My hands were shaking as I kept reading through the contract. 2% of royalties. The Andy Griffith Show ran for 8 seasons, then decades of syndication. Reruns playing on channels across the country every single day. The royalty payments from something like that would be Substantial. I did some quick math in my head and nearly fell off my folding chair. We're talking millions, potentially tens of millions over the years. And none of it had ever been paid. There was no cancellation, no expiration clause, just a clean, signed agreement, forgotten, not voided. According to the paperwork, Sheldon Leonard had died in the 1990s. The original production company had been sold and resold more times than I could count. Rights had been transferred. Contracts had been buried in corporate mergers. And somewhere along the way, a handshake deal between a small-town diner owner and a hungry young producer had been forgotten. Not forgotten. Ignored. Because $300 in 1961 had turned into a fortune by the 1980s. And nobody wanted to admit they owed that fortune to a guy who served coffee and pie in West Virginia. This wasn't just unfair. This was theft. Decades of theft, hidden behind corporate lawyers and bureaucratic red tape. I sat there in that cold storage unit, holding a piece of paper that could change everything. This wasn't just about my inheritance anymore. This was about justice. About a good man who'd helped someone chase their dreams and never gotten what he was promised in return. Grandpa Joe had given me more than a cash register. He'd given me a mystery, a quest, a chance to right a wrong that had been festering for over 60 years. Remember how I said I wasn't ready to let his life story end in a junk heap? Well, turns out it wasn't going to. Not by a long shot. But looking at that contract, I realized I was in way over my head. This wasn't the kind of problem you could solve by filing a complaint with customer service. This was corporate America, at its worst. Powerful people who'd spent decades covering their tracks. Lawyers who specialized in making inconvenient contracts disappear. I needed help. Professional help. The kind of help that cost money I didn't have and required connections I'd never made. I needed a lawyer who wasn't related to my sister. The irony wasn't lost on me. Sarah's husband could have handled this case in his sleep. Probably would have wanted to. But after what they'd done to me, I'd rather represent myself with a law degree from Google University than ask them for anything. Besides, something told me this case was going to require someone special. Someone who understood that this wasn't just about money. This was about family, about honor, about keeping promises, even when everyone else has forgotten they were made. I spent the rest of that night reading through every piece of paper in that secret compartment. More contracts, correspondence, even some old photographs of Grandpa Joe with people I didn't recognize. People in suits who looked like they belonged in Hollywood, not West Virginia. There was a whole side to my grandfather I'd never known about. A side that had dreamed bigger than just running a diner. A side that had taken risks and made connections and believed in people. And those people had left him holding the bag when their dreams came true. That night, I didn't sleep. Couldn't sleep. My mind was racing with possibilities and problems in equal measure. How do you prove a 60-year-old handshake deal? How do you fight against corporations that have been covering their tracks since before you were born? But for the first time since Grandpa Joe died, I felt something I'd almost forgotten existed. Hope. Real, honest-to-God hope that maybe, just maybe, the good guys could still win sometimes. Never give up, because you never know what's waiting around the corner. I'd heard that phrase 1,000 times. But that night in the storage unit, holding a contract that could change everything, I finally understood what it meant. The cash register that had seemed like such a cruel joke, such a pathetic consolation prize, suddenly looked different. It wasn't just a machine anymore. It was a time capsule, a message from my grandfather that justice still mattered. He'd hidden this contract away, waiting for the right moment to use it. Maybe he'd planned to fight this battle himself someday. Maybe he just couldn't bring himself to face another long legal fight in his old age. Or maybe, just maybe, he knew that whoever ended up with this old cash register would eventually find what he'd hidden inside. Either way, I wasn't going to let him down. As dawn started creeping through the storage unit windows, I carefully rewrapped the contract in its plastic wrapping and put everything back in the secret compartment. But not before making photocopies of every single document at the 24-hour Kinko's down the road. I had work in a few hours, routes to run, packages to deliver, normal life to pretend I was still living. But everything had changed. I wasn't just James Hartwell, the UPS driver anymore. I was James Hartwell, keeper of family secrets and seeker of justice. And I was about to find out what it really meant to fight for the American dream. This wasn't the end of my story. This was just the beginning. But where do you start when you're one guy going up against an entire entertainment industry? How do you find a lawyer willing to take on a case that's been buried for 60 years? Well, turns out sometimes the answer to that question is closer than you think. Sometimes it's sitting in your high school yearbook, wearing a cap and gown, with dreams of making the world a more just place. Sometimes it's someone you've been too afraid to call for 25 years, because you thought you'd already missed your chance at everything good in life. Sometimes the past doesn't just give you problems to solve. Sometimes it gives you exactly the person you need to solve them. Funny how life works. You spend months thinking you're all alone in the world, and then you remember there are people who've been fighting the good fight a lot longer than you have. That's exactly how I ended up thinking about Emily Martinez, or Emily Chen now, since she got married and divorced in the years since we graduated. I spent 3 days staring at that yearbook photo before I worked up the courage to call her. Emily Martinez, class of 1996, voted most likely to change the world. She'd been the girl who organized protests against the vending machine prices, who started a legal aid club, who made the rest of us believe that justice actually mattered. She'd also been a girl I'd been too scared to ask to prom. Finding her wasn't hard. In a town the size of ours, successful people stand out like neon signs. Emily Chun, attorney at law, with her own practice downtown, specialized in corporate litigation and David versus Goliath cases. The universe has a twisted sense of humor sometimes. I drove past her office building 4 times before I finally parked. This wasn't some strip mall law office with peeling paint and broken dreams. This was glass and steel, and the kind of success that made my UPS uniform feel like a costume from another life. The receptionist looked at me like I'd wandered in from a construction site, which, considering how nervous I was, probably wasn't far from the truth. Emily came out to meet me in the lobby, and time did that weird thing where it collapses and expands all at once. She looked exactly the same, just more professional, more confident, the kind of person who belonged in a building like this, while I felt like I should be delivering packages to the back door. But when she smiled, it was the same smile from high school, the one that made you feel like you were the only person in the room who mattered. She led me to her office, and I tried not to gawk at the law books, the diplomas, the view of downtown that probably cost more per month than I made in 3. This was what success looked like. This was what happened when you didn't let life derail your dreams. I laid out the whole story. The betrayal by my siblings, the cash register, the secret compartment, the contract with Sheldon Leonard. Emily listened without interrupting, taking notes on a legal pad, her expression getting more serious with every detail. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked to see the photocopies. She studied them for what felt like an hour, but was probably only 15 minutes. Every page, every signature, every detail. I watched her face, trying to read her expression, wondering if she was about to tell me I was chasing windmills. Finally, she looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Part excitement, part concern, part something that might have been respect. She told me the contract looked legitimate. More than legitimate, it looked airtight. The signatures were authentic. The terms were clear, and there was nothing in the language that would void the agreement. This wasn't some handshake deal that could be dismissed in court. This was a real contract with real legal weight. But then came the reality check. Fighting this case would be like going to war with the entertainment industry. We weren't just talking about one company. We were talking about a web of corporations, subsidiaries, and licensing deals that had been built up over 60 years. The current rights holders had deep pockets and deeper connections. They could tie this up in court for years, bleeding me dry with legal fees before we ever saw a dime. Emily was brutally honest about our chances. 50-50 at best. Maybe worse, depending on how dirty the other side wanted to play. But she also said something that made my decision for me. She said this was exactly the kind of case she'd gone to law school to fight. The retainer fee was more money than I had in my savings account. But Emily worked out a payment plan that wouldn't leave me eating ramen noodles for the next 5 years. More importantly, she agreed to take the case on contingency, meaning she only got paid if we won. That's when I knew she believed in this as much as I did. Lawyers don't risk their time and resources on cases they don't think they can win. Over the next few weeks, Emily did her homework. She researched the show's production history, tracked down the chain of ownership for the rights, identified every company that had profited from Grandpa Joe's $300 over the past 6 decades. The numbers were staggering. Conservative estimates put the total royalties at over $2 million. 2% of that was still life-changing money. While Emily worked her legal magic, I tried to keep my regular life going. UPS routes, storage unit visits, pretending like I wasn't potentially sitting on the biggest lawsuit in West Virginia entertainment history, which, granted, wasn't saying much, but still, the hardest part was not telling anyone. Emily had warned me that word would get out eventually, and when it did, we'd be dealing with media attention and corporate pressure tactics. But until we were ready to file, secrecy was our best weapon. So I kept delivering packages and cleaning that cash register and trying not to think about what would happen if we lost. 3 weeks after our first meeting, Emily called me with news. The current rights holders, a media conglomerate that owned half of Hollywood, wanted to meet. They'd gotten wind of our intentions somehow, probably through the legal research Emily had been doing. They wanted to make us an offer. The meeting was set for the following Tuesday at Emily's office. Professional, controlled environment. Emily warned me that this would be their first attempt to make the problem go away cheaply, and I should be prepared for insultingly low numbers. She was right, but even she wasn't prepared for how insulting they'd go. 3 corporate lawyers showed up in suits that probably cost more than my truck. They had briefcases full of precedents and intimidation tactics, speaking in legal jargon designed to make regular people feel stupid and overwhelmed. But they hadn't counted on Emily. She matched them word for word, precedent for precedent, making it clear that we weren't some amateur operation they could steamroll. After an hour of legal posturing, they finally made their offer, $150,000. Take it or leave it. Final offer. Sign a non-disclosure agreement and walk away. I looked at Emily, and she gave me the slightest shake of her head. We discussed this possibility. $150,000 was still insulting, a fraction of what we were owed, designed to make me think it was easier to take the money and run than fight for real justice. I thought about Grandpa Joe, standing behind that diner counter, believing in people's dreams enough to risk his own financial security. I thought about every Sunday afternoon we'd spent watching Andy Griffith together, him smiling that secret smile while the opening credits rolled. I told them to keep their money. The lead lawyer, some shark in a $5,000 suit, tried to intimidate me, talk about the risks of going to trial, the cost of litigation, the slim chances of victory against corporate giants. Reminded me that I was just a UPS driver going up against billion-dollar companies. That's when Emily stepped in with a reminder of her own. She reminded them that David beat Goliath with nothing but a slingshot and the certainty that he was fighting for something bigger than himself. After they left, Emily and I sat in her office, processing what had just happened. The corporate machine was already in motion, trying to crush us before we could become a real threat. But their desperation to settle quickly told us something important. They knew we had a real case. Emily started preparing for war. Discovery Motion's witness lists, expert testimony on entertainment law and contract validity. Every day brought new paperwork, new strategies, new ways to attack a problem that had been buried for 60 years. And every day, I felt more like I was fighting for something bigger than money. This was about keeping promises, about standing up for the little guy, about proving that sometimes, just sometimes, justice could win out over corporate greed. The stress was getting to me. Every phone call from Emily could mean good news or legal disaster. But I also started having dreams about Grandpa Joe, dreams where he was proud of me for not backing down, for fighting the fight he'd never had the chance to finish himself. Emily became my anchor in all of this chaos. She had this way of explaining complex legal concepts in terms that made sense, of breaking down impossible problems into manageable pieces. She made me feel like we actually had a chance of winning. More than that, working with Emily reminded me why I'd had such a crush on her in high school. She was brilliant, passionate, uncompromising when it came to doing the right thing. She treated me like an equal partner in this fight, not just some client who'd stumbled into her office with a crazy story. When she worked late preparing motions, I'd bring her coffee and sandwiches from the deli down the street. When the corporate lawyers tried new intimidation tactics, she'd call me with updates and strategies, making sure I never felt alone in this battle. Somewhere in all the legal briefs and corporate machinations, I started to realize that this case had given me something unexpected. Not just a chance at justice for Grandpa Joe, but a chance to reconnect with someone who'd always represented the best parts of my past. The preliminary hearings were scheduled for early fall. Emily warned me that this would be when things got really ugly. The corporate lawyers would try every trick in the book to get our case dismissed, to discredit the contract, to make us look like opportunistic gold diggers trying to cash in on a dead man's fantasies. But Emily had tricks of her own. She'd found evidence of similar contracts in the same time period, precedents for honoring decades-old entertainment agreements, expert witnesses who could testify to the validity of Grandpa Joe's signature and the authenticity of the paperwork. She was building a fortress around our case, brick by legal brick. One evening, as we were reviewing depositions in Emily's office, she looked up from her legal pad and made a joke about how my humor was keeping her sane through all this corporate insanity. I made some crack about my comedy being an acquired taste, like cheap wine or really old cheese. She laughed, actually laughed, and said something that stuck with me. She said I was handling all this pressure better than most of her clients, that I had a strength she hadn't expected. Coming from someone who'd built her career on fighting impossible cases, that meant more than any settlement check ever could. That's when I realized this wasn't just about the money anymore. This was about proving to myself that I could fight for something that mattered, that I could be the kind of man Grandpa Joe had raised me to be. But the corporate lawyers weren't done with their games. Emily warned me that they'd probably try to dig up dirt on me, on my family, on Grandpa Joe. They'd look for any angle to discredit our case, any weakness they could exploit. She was right. Within a week, I was getting calls from private investigators, reporters, and corporate representatives trying to get me to say something that could be used against us in court. Emily coached me on how to handle the pressure. Don't talk to anyone without her present. Don't sign anything. Don't let them intimidate me into giving up. But the real test wasn't going to be dealing with their investigators. The real test was going to be walking into that courthouse and facing down an army of corporate lawyers who saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to their continued profits. As the court date approached, Emily and I spent more and more time together, preparing for every possible scenario. She taught me how to testify, how to handle cross-examination, how to stay calm when the other side tried to rattle me. But more than that, she reminded me every day why we were fighting this battle. Not just for the money, though that would certainly change my life. We were fighting for the principle that promises should be kept, that good people shouldn't be forgotten, that sometimes a little guy can win if he's willing to stand up and fight. The night before our first major hearing, Emily and I were in her office until nearly midnight, going over final preparations. As I was getting ready to leave, she told me something I'll never forget. She said this case had reminded her why she'd become a lawyer in the first place, that somewhere between law school and building her practice, she'd started to forget that the law was supposed to be about justice, not just billable hours and corporate settlements. Working with me, fighting for Grandpa Joe's contract, had given her back something she'd lost along the way, a sense of purpose that went beyond winning cases or building a reputation. Standing there in her office, surrounded by legal briefs and evidence boxes, and the weight of 60 years of injustice, I realized something that should have been obvious from the beginning. This case wasn't just about proving that Grandpa Joe deserved his royalties. It wasn't just about standing up to corporate bullies or fighting for the American dream. This case had brought me back to Emily Martinez, the girl who'd always believed in fighting for what's right, who'd grown up to be exactly the kind of person the world needed more of. And whether we won or lost in court, I was starting to think that might be the most important victory of all. September 15th, 2024. That's a date I'll remember until the day I die. Not because it was my birthday or anniversary or any of the usual life milestones, but because that's the day a judge's gavel came down and changed everything. The courtroom was packed. Media, corporate lawyers in their $1,000 suits, and me in the best outfit I owned, which still looked like I borrowed it from someone else's life. Emily sat beside me, calm as still water, while my heart was beating so hard I thought everyone could hear it. When Judge Morrison picked up that gavel, the whole room went silent. You know that moment in movies where time stops? This was exactly like that, except it was real, and my entire future was hanging in the balance. The gavel hit the bench with a sound louder than thunder, louder than every injustice that had ever been swept on the corporate rug. The judge's words rang out clear as church bells. The court finds a contract valid and enforceable. Judgment for the plaintiff in the amount of $3.4 million, plus interest and court costs. $3.4 million. 63 years of unpaid royalties from the Andy Griffith Show. Money that should have been flowing to Grandpa Joe's Diner all those decades, helping him expand, maybe franchise, maybe just live without worrying about every penny. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but sit there while Emily grabbed my arm and whispered that we'd won. We'd actually won. The corporate lawyers were already packing their briefcases, probably planning their appeals. But I didn't care. For this moment, justice had prevailed. David had taken down Goliath with nothing but an old contract and the truth. As Mark Twain once said, never tell the truth to those who don't deserve it. But sometimes the truth finds its own way. And boy, did it ever find its way that day. Emily and I walked out of that courthouse together, and I swear the world looked different. The sky was bluer, the air was cleaner, and every person we passed seemed to be smiling. Probably just the endorphins talking. But I didn't care. The local news picked up the story within hours. David defeats Goliath. UPS driver wins multi-million-dollar lawsuit against entertainment giant. Some of the papers even started calling it the case of the silent cash register, which would have made Grandpa Joe laugh until he cried. That's when the phone calls started. Reporters wanting interviews, lawyers offering to handle the appeals, and yeah, even Liam and Sarah. Funny how quickly they remembered they had a brother when his name was in the headlines with a 7-figure settlement attached to it. I let those calls go to voicemail. Whatever they had to say could wait until I decided if I ever wanted to hear it. But the real victory wasn't the money. Don't get me wrong, the money was life-changing. But the real victory was Emily. After months of fighting this battle together, after seeing each other at our worst and most determined, something had shifted between us. The professional relationship had become something deeper, something that felt like it had been waiting 25 years to happen. We started spending time together that had nothing to do with legal strategies or corporate depositions. Real time, coffee shop conversations about books and movies, and all the dreams we'd had in high school that somehow still mattered. Emily had this way of making everything feel possible. Not just the lawsuit, everything. She'd look at me like I was someone worth knowing, someone worth fighting alongside, someone worth more than I'd ever thought I deserved. The betrayal by Liam and Sarah had left me thinking I couldn't trust anyone. That family was just a word people use before they stab you in the back. But Emily was showing me that some people actually meant what they said. Some people actually stuck around when things got tough. She wasn't just my lawyer anymore. She was my anchor in a world that finally made sense again. 3 weeks after the verdict, we were walking through downtown on one of those perfect October evenings when the air is crisp and the leaves are showing off. Emily was telling me about some case she was working on, and I was only half listening because I was too busy watching the way she moved her hands when she talked. That's when I realized I was in love with her. Not the high school crush kind of love, but the real deal, the kind that makes you want to build a life with someone, to wake up next to them every morning and face whatever the world throws at you together. I had Grandma's engagement ring in my pocket, the one Grandpa Joe had custom made for her back in 1955. He'd given it to me years ago, saying someday I'd find the right woman to give it to. Had been carrying it around for weeks, trying to work up the courage to ask the question that could change everything. We stopped by the old fountain in the town square, the one that had been there since before either of us was born. Emily was laughing about something I had said, Probably another one of my terrible jokes, when I pulled out the small velvet box. My hands were shaking worse than they had in the courtroom. This was scarier than facing down a room full of corporate lawyers. This was my heart on the line. I told her she'd help me find justice when I thought it was impossible, that she'd given me back my faith in people, in fighting for what's right, in the possibility that good things could still happen to regular folks like me. Then I asked her to marry me. The smile that spread across her face was brighter than every star in the West Virginia sky. She said yes before I even finished fumbling through my prepared speech about wanting to spend the rest of my life making her laugh and supporting her crusades for justice. We stood there by that old fountain, two middle-aged people who'd found each other again after 25 years of living separate lives, and it felt like the whole universe had finally clicked into place. That old cash register hadn't just held Grandpa Joe's contract. It had held my future. The first thing I did with the settlement money was buy back the diner. Not the land where it used to be. That was still a car wash and probably always would be. But I found another spot downtown, a place with the same kind of character and history. I spent months restoring it to look exactly like Grandpa Joe's place. Red vinyl booths, black and white checker floor, vintage coffee machine, even that old NCR cash register sitting in a place of honor behind the counter. The sign out front reads, Diner of Forgotten Royalties. Emily thought it was perfect. A monument to justice served, a place where the past and future could sit down together over coffee and pie. Still works, too, though I mainly use it for show. Sometimes tourists come by just to see the famous silent cash register that sparked a multi-million-dollar lawsuit. I like to joke with Emily that I finally mastered the art of pushing those buttons. But seriously, opening that diner again feels like I've come full circle. Every morning I unlock the door and turn on the lights, and I can almost hear Grandpa Joe's approval. This is what he would have wanted. Not just the money, but the restoration of something that mattered. Emily stops by every morning before work for coffee, and whatever pie we're featuring that day. We talk about our plans, our dreams, the future we're building together. Sometimes we don't talk at all, just sit there comfortable in each other's company while the morning regulars filter in. The funny thing about justice is that it doesn't just fix the original wrong. It has this ripple effect that touches everything around it. Winning that lawsuit didn't just give me financial security. It gave me back my faith in the system, in people, in the possibility that hard work and persistence can still triumph over corporate greed. More than that, it brought Emily back into my life. Without that contract hidden in the cash register, I never would have had the courage to call her. Never would have discovered that the girl I'd been too scared to ask to prom had grown up to be exactly the kind of woman I needed in my life. Some nights, after we close the diner, Emily and I sit in one of those red vinyl booths and talk about everything and nothing, about the cases she's working on, about menu changes for the diner, about the wedding we're planning for next spring. And sometimes we just sit there in comfortable silence. Two people who found each other again after a quarter century of separate journeys, grateful for old contracts and hidden compartments, and a kind of quiet love that sneaks up on you when you're too tired to believe in fairy tales anymore. But you know what they say about happy endings. They're really just new beginnings in disguise. Because even though I'd won the lawsuit, even though I'd found love and restored Grandpa Joe's legacy, there were still a few loose threads from the past that hadn't been tied up yet. Threads that involved two people who thought they'd seen the last of me when they handed over that old cash register. Two people who weren't too happy about reading their names in the newspaper as the siblings who tried to cheat their brother out of his inheritance. Sometimes the past doesn't stay buried, even when you think you've moved on. Sometimes it comes knocking on your door, demanding its own slice of the pie you've worked so hard to bake. 6 months after Emily said yes, the Diner of Forgotten Royalties had become something I never expected. Not just a restaurant, but a destination. A legend in its own right. We'd gotten married in a small ceremony that spring, right there in the diner with the cash register as our witness. Emily wore her grandmother's dress. I wore Grandpa Joe's best suit, and about 50 of our closest friends and family filled those red vinyl booths to watch us promise to love each other for better or worse, richer or poorer, in sickness and in health. People drove from 3 states away to sit in those red vinyl booths and hear the story of the silent cash register. They'd order apple pie and coffee while I told them about Grandpa Joe, about finding that hidden contract, about David taking down Goliath with nothing but persistence, and a really good lawyer who happened to be the love of his life. The old NCR cash register sat behind the counter, like a monument to the impossible. Tourists would take selfies with it, reporters would ask to interview it, and kids would stare at it like it was some kind of magical artifact, which, in a way, it was. Emily would laugh when she saw me polishing it every morning. She'd say that cash register had done more for justice than most judges she knew, and she wasn't wrong. That old machine had become proof that sometimes the little guy really can win, that promises made decades ago still matter, that the truth has a way of surfacing even when powerful people try to bury it. The diner was packed that Tuesday morning in March when I saw them walking up the front steps. Two figures I'd hoped never to see again, moving like sharks who'd smell blood in the water. Liam and Sarah, my dear siblings, who disappeared completely after the newspapers picked up the story of their generous inheritance gift to their brother. Funny how they'd suddenly remembered they had family, when that family's name was attached to a 7-figure court settlement. They walked into the diner like they owned the place, which, considering how they'd handled Grandpa Joe's actual property, probably felt natural to them. Liam had that same smug expression he'd worn when he handed me the cash register. Sarah looked like she was calculating square footage and profit margins. Emily was at the counter, reviewing some legal briefs over her morning coffee. She looked up when they walked in, and I saw her expression shift from curious to dangerous. She'd heard enough stories about my siblings to recognize trouble when it walked through the door. They didn't waste time with pleasantries. Liam launched into some speech about family obligations and sharing good fortune. Sarah nodded along, talking about how they'd always supported me, how they'd given me that cash register knowing it would bring me luck someday. The audacity was breathtaking. They'd literally stolen my inheritance, left me with what they thought was worthless junk, and now they wanted credit for my success. It was like watching someone steal your car and then demand gas money. I let them talk for about 5 minutes before I started laughing. Not a polite chuckle, but a full-blown, can't-catch-my-breath kind of laugh that made every customer in the diner turn around and stare. Liam stopped mid-sentence, looking confused and a little nervous. Sarah's face went red, which happened whenever someone didn't take her seriously. And I just kept laughing, because the whole situation was so ridiculous it felt like something out of a comedy movie. When I finally caught my breath, I looked at them with what must have been the biggest smile of my life. I told them how grateful I was for their generosity, how giving me that old cash register was the best thing they'd ever done for me, even if they hadn't meant it that way. I explained how that worthless piece of junk had led me to a $3.4 million court judgment, how it had brought me back together with the love of my life, how it had given me the chance to restore Grandpa Joe's legacy and build something meaningful. And then I thanked them for being exactly the kind of greedy, short-sighted people who would sell their family's history for quick cash, because without that, none of this would have happened. The look on their faces was priceless. Confusion mixed with dawning horror as they realized I wasn't offering them anything. No cut of the settlement, no partnership in the diner, no family reconciliation where we all pretended the betrayal had never happened. Liam tried to shift tactics, talking about legal challenges and family claims on inheritance. That's when Emily stood up from her booth and walked over to join the conversation. She introduced herself as my wife and legal counsel, which made Sarah's face go even redder. Then she calmly explained that any attempt to challenge the settlement would result in criminal fraud charges, since the cash register and its contents had been legally gifted to me with full documentation. Emily had that quiet, dangerous tone she used in court when she was about to destroy someone's argument. She mentioned that she'd already spoken with the district attorney about the suspicious circumstances surrounding the estate sale, and how quickly certain family members had moved to liquidate assets while the rightful heir was out of state. She suggested that Liam and Sarah might want to consult with their own legal counsel before making any further claims, because criminal fraud carries serious penalties in West Virginia. As Winston Churchill once said, measure your revenge, but don't live by it. Just give them a taste of their own medicine. Watching them deflate was like watching air leak out a balloon. All that bluster and entitlement just collapsed when they realized they were facing someone who actually knew how the law worked. Someone who couldn't be intimidated or bought off or convinced to roll over. Leah mumbled something about not meaning any harm, just looking out for family. Sarah tried to backtrack, claiming they'd always known the cash register was valuable and had saved it especially for me. But the damage was done. They'd shown their true colors, and everybody in that diner had seen it. They left without another word, walking out of my life the same way they'd try to walk out with my inheritance. Small, petty, and utterly defeated. Emily came over and put her arm around me, and we watched through the window as they drove away. She asked if I felt sorry for them, if I wanted to reach out and try to rebuild the family relationship. I thought about it for maybe 2 seconds before shaking my head. Some bridges aren't worth rebuilding. Some people show you exactly who they are, and the smart thing is to believe them the first time. That evening, after we closed the diner and sent the last customer home with a full belly and a good story, Emily and I sat in our favorite booth and talked about the day, about justice and family, and the weird ways life has of working out. She told me that the cash register that everyone thought was silent had actually told the most important story she'd ever heard. A story about keeping promises, about fighting for what's right, about how love and justice sometimes come disguised as old junk that nobody else wants. I looked at that old NCR machine sitting behind the counter, still gleaming from its daily polish, still ready to ring up sales and dispense justice in equal measure. It had been Grandpa Joe's partner for decades, then my inheritance, then my treasure map, and finally my monument to the impossible. Sometimes, to find your happiness, you just need to dust off an old piece of your past and see what secrets it's been keeping. Sometimes the most valuable things in life come wrapped in plastic and hidden in places where only the desperate think to look. And sometimes, if you're really lucky, fighting for justice doesn't just give you money or revenge or the satisfaction of being right. Sometimes it gives you back everything you didn't even know you'd lost, your faith in people, your belief in happy endings, and the kind of quiet love that sneaks up on you when you're too busy fighting the good fight to notice a happening. That old cash register never did learn how to stay silent. And thank God for that.